classroom, and I'm so excited for them to be part of this conversation here. But no one has joined us to listen to me thank folks, and so I want you to hear our panelists talk about this movie. So towards that end, I want to foreground the way that this conversation is historic, right? This movie's been around for almost 4 years now, but it's never been the subject of a Hendrix sponsored conversation at the end of election day week, right? This is a really precious, singular, unique time, and it makes our conversation not derivative, not another review of all the reviews that have been published beautifully about Moonlight, but we're here together to make something new. And I really want to foreground the singularity of this experience. Of course, we know that the film has earned an Academy Award for Best Picture. It's an historical win. The film, when it was released, was regarded by many critics as a film of great hope after a tumultuous 2016 presidential campaign. And here we are talking about the film now after or in the middle of our most recent election. And so the film itself doesn't change, but the world around the film changes, and we can appreciate new meanings and relationships and discoveries thanks to where we are now. I know that watching the movie this evening, when Black talks about being in Atlanta, right? That's a new thing after this week of focusing on Georgia. I guess a few days, but it feels like a week. So thinking about how the world changes relative to just these past few days. And so what I want to kind of foreground here in our opening remarks from our panelists is some kind of how to say it. This film has made an impression on you, or you wouldn't have agreed to be part of this panel. I'm assuming that you haven't agreed to be part of the panel because you want to talk about a film that doesn't make an impression on you, right? So I think it would be useful for each of you to clarify for yourself, for each other, for our audience, exactly the nature of your regard for the movie. Maybe think of it in two ways, right? Something about the film that you remember the first time you saw it, or that has been striking to you in the past, alongside a way that the film has created some kind of new meaning for you now in this moment, right? So that would be a way that I want to open things up, kind of your initial regard for Moonlight, things you appreciate about it relative to what newly you come to appreciate over time. Thanks.
I can go ahead and start off. I think that when this was my second time screening this movie, the first time that I watched it, I think the thing that really stood out to me was how Chiron couldn't express himself fully to the full potential in the beginning like he wanted to. His sexuality, his way of thinking, he couldn't do that. And I think the reason that it stuck out to me is because it resonated with me, and it is something that has occurred in my life where I'm sure we've all had those instances where we've been in a room full of people and we don't feel comfortable. Um, or we're just in a situation and we don't feel like we can fully express ourselves. And for Chiron, I mean, that happened throughout his life. So that's one part that really stuck with me. And honestly, I think it stuck in the second time too. It just doubled on meaning. It was just more of, oh my goodness, it was heartbreaking how he couldn't get to that point in his life. And he did get to a different point in his life that was for survival and absolutely necessary, but it was just as heartbreaking as in the beginning when I viewed it.
I can go next. Well, for one, I feel like every time that I watch this film, I feel like it gives me something that I didn't know that I needed per se, because it's something that you don't see all the times often represented in film or just in the media in general. And that's characters that look like me or other people of color. And those characters not being supplemental and one-dimensional and simply placed there in the name of being diverse or trying to achieve diversity in film. And I feel like Barry Jenkins just does an amazing job of that in making all of his characters multidimensional and just really diving into, I think, the parts of our lives that aren't always showcased or not as oftentimes so willing to be put on the forefront. And I think that's what this film really gives its audience is that vulnerability with Chiron, and then also that like ticket to be vulnerable with yourself as well as you're watching the film.
I guess I can go next. What really stuck with me about Moonlight is how relatable it is, especially like to my personal situation. Like Mackenzie said, like it's not often there are films like starring Black people, like Black people are in these films and make up the cast of these films, and it's not just supplementary, it's not just like over to the side just being a token. And so like that really is something that stuck with me. And also you don't really see films about Black people that are part of the LGBTQ community, and like that really stuck with me because I'm also part of the community. And so it's like being able to see a sort of representation of myself on screen, especially like amidst all the hate and everything, you know, that just exists within society. It was very refreshing, a little hope giving almost. Yeah.
Yeah, so to round it out, I have sort of the distinct like position because the first time I watched this film it was in a film class with Dr. McKim, so I was kind of coming at it from that angle of like what can I pull out of this, like what am I like, that critical eye. And I think that's a really, I'm glad I went into it like that because it allowed me to pull a lot from it. And the first time I watched it, I think the main thing that sort of struck me overall was the way it, even in moments that shouldn't be unsettling, there's this like weight and this sort of feeling of being unsettled, like whether that's the way the light hits or there's like the music picks up in a scene where you think you should be allowed to sort of like relax or breathe a little and it doesn't let you. And I really like that it doesn't let you sit comfortably like the whole time. And then watching it this time, I think I'm just picking up on little details here. So I was watching like just sort of the color blocking a lot throughout the film. Like I was watching it change from blue to green to sort of to these reds, and then when Chiron is dressed completely in black, and there's just all of this movement between these different colors throughout the film. I was really like catching that more than I did the first time, and I really like that you can sort of pick something each time you watch the film and really follow it and develop it through, and that really reflects how careful the filmmakers are in making those choices. So
those were really beautiful reflections, and I want to move from those opening points and ideas into attention to the film's structure, right? So it's the case that this movie is based on a stage play that is structured relative to 3 different ages that we see, of course, in the film. But instead of seeing Little and then Chiron and then Black, the structure originally was calling for Little's doing something, then Chiron's doing something parallel, and then Black's doing something parallel. And so I'm curious about what it means to spend 1/3 of the film with Little and then Chiron and then Black, and what this particular compression of a person's life over the course of a feature film affords us. Furthermore, I want to add that Barry Jenkins created as a like postscript of sorts, or as an epilogue, or as a final third of the film, everything that happens after Chiron gets in the car to go see Kevin, right? So that's all invented for the film as opposed to something that was on the stage. And so I wonder if you can reflect a little bit on the implications of this particular structure for you, what it means to spend some time with young Little, and then adolescent, teenage Chiron, and then grown up Black in this particular way. Like, we watch the movie and we are, relatively speaking, 2 hours older, right? But we are relating differently to each of these characters in these ages. And so I wonder what that particular elliptical editing accomplishes here. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I think that these three different eras, it shows us how he changed based on people and how he did not change based on people, and what he expresses to people and what he does not. And it gives us the backstory of who he is and who he grew up around and why he suffered, and we suffered with him. We suffered with him as he was a child. We suffered with him as he was a teen, and I mean, as an adult, he got the closure and everything, but it was still, we got the suffering from those other two eras of his life. And it really brought the entire film together. And if we had just seen the ending, let's say when he was in the car, and what really struck out to me was that he was basically, when I first saw it, and I first saw that one scene of him in the car, I was like, whoa, Juan came back. And no, Juan didn't come back, but he took on the appearance of Juan, and he took on the characterization of him, and to protect himself. And if we had only seen that as Black, as the hard version of himself, we would have been like, wow, okay, cool. He's driving in a car and he's meeting an old friend. But instead, we took the pain from the beginnings of the film, and we understand his regrets and his challenges. And it kind of begs the question of, how much of a person do we really know in real life? Because growing up with someone and seeing all of their different challenges makes it very different than seeing someone for the first time when they're 18. And arguably 18 is not that old, but I'm 18, and people in college meeting me for the first time, it's very different than meeting me when I was younger. So I think that really, that was that was what I had to say about that.
I agree. I think the film gains a lot from the division of the chapters. As Max said earlier, there's like this growing tension as the story progresses. And I feel like you don't capture that in totality if you don't start from the beginning to the end. And I feel like it's more powerful that way because as we begin the story, we don't necessarily know what we're building up to. We know that we are expecting something big, and we know that these moments are changing Chiron because we're seeing them happen in real time, and we're growing with him as he does, going through these really monumental moments. And it's amazing to see them all play out in the different eras of his life because he also reacts to them so differently as he grows. And some of that is because of him becoming who he is, but also part of that is because of the fact that he can't be who he is in entirety. Like, he's growing, but only in the way that his surroundings are allowing him to. And in a large part, he's suppressing parts of himself. And I think we gain a lot of insight into that by seeing him in those three stages of his life.
I completely agree. It's like they said, when you break the film into those three parts, when you can look at them separately and kind of see, what goes on, the inner workings and everything, and when you can kind of take what you learn and drag it across the film, it connects it all, right? So like Mackenzie said, had we seen him, just as Black at the beginning of the film, you know, basically grew up to be an imitation of Juan. Had we not started at the beginning, we wouldn't know the significance of the car or the little crown or the white beater. Like progressing through the film the way we did and growing with the character allowed us to have a deeper understanding and a deeper connection to the character, and it allowed us to know exactly the reasons why he is the way he is, why he's doing what he's doing, and the points of kind of progression. So like the children were beating him up and bullying him, and that caused him to to burst really. And so because we understood that this is what was leading up to that, we can understand his mindset at his older times in a way.
Yeah, I think all of those are really good points, and it's just making me come up with more questions than answers, which I guess is a good point on the film's part. But something that, just from a structural standpoint, that I think the three parts do, because it does sort of give you the appearance of a play and give you sort of like you can really feel your place as a spectator in that moment, because you're being sort of pushed through these moments in time. And even those moments in time, like, we don't get really clear breaks between them. So there's those like moments of flashing light, and we sort of get introduced into the new period of his life before we get a title for it. So they all bleed into one another, and it just sort of reminds me, at least, that I'm watching Little and then Chiron and then Black in a way that everyone else in his life is trying to watch him. And there are pieces of his life that, like, we don't get to see because we're really seeing things. It's kind of hard to talk about what he allows people to see and doesn't, but there are, like, the time that he's in jail, like, we don't see any of that because he doesn't want us to see it. Almost, it's like we're in his mind and he's sort of directing us in that way. And I think that's it's just a really interesting way to go through his thoughts when he's not speaking for most of the film, so we're really just observing him and observing from his point of view in sort of this simultaneous way that, like I said earlier, like, it's got this like sort of uncomfortable feeling to it, but it also forces you to sort of think about your own spectatorship. And I think that's a really sort of interesting thing that it does.
These are really beautiful reflections, and I'm so excited. But like, I'm used to teaching, right? So like, then I can, like, each person talks, then I can be like, oh, and so it's exciting to be in a space where I'm listening more than connecting, even as I so want to address each of the things that you've said so thoughtfully. I realize, per the questions and reflections on structure and what is legible here and what is not, and the stakes of our learning these particular moments of his life as defining, that like there then is this argument for these moments, the large and the small, as the ones that shape him, right? And it's hard not to reflect, as we're in this space of my own parents are the people who've been with me like my whole life, in ways that they're watching me now in this space with you all, and you've been with me in classrooms that certainly my parents haven't been in. And it's like, so there's this wild like confluence or conflation of what it means to be seen or to see or to know, right? Like that we know each other as Hendrik's peers here now, and then we'll go do things after this conversation, but we are visible in this particular synchronicity at this moment. We have a wonderful question from the audience, and the audience wants to hear, friends, about the most significant scene for you, or a scene that ties the whole film together. So this is a lovely opportunity for us to describe what we love and why. You all know probably what I would choose, so I won't talk about that, but I would love to hear what you would choose and why.
So I have two favorite scenes. And so the first would be the scene where Juan is teaching Chiron how to swim. And this is due to a number of things, not only the cinematography and the camera placement and the sounds and how you feel like you're in the water learning with him. I was literally holding my breath when the camera would have moments where the water would completely submerge it. And I think in that moment, like, yes, he's learning how to swim, like literally, but also symbolically, Juan has taught Chiron so much. And I feel like that scene really speaks to that. And I think that scene also speaks to, it's sort of a foreshadowing of what is to come. The Chiron being helped by Juan and him really molding him, but then also the part where he like lets him go and tells him that it's his turn to try on his own is what happens in the next chapter. And I think that was so beautiful. And in that same scene, while Chiron is teaching him to swim, and afterwards he tells him that you can't let people tell you who you are ever. That's what you must decide for yourself. And I feel like that honestly set the tone for most of the rest of the film. It's Chiron struggling with who he feels he is and who the people around him are pressuring him to be, or what he feels he needs to be safe, or to be seen, or to be heard. And I feel like that was just really heavy. And then the second scene that was really intense for me was the one after Chiron gets beat up at school and he comes home, he ices his face, and when he looks in the mirror, he looks completely different. It's been a total shift, his eyes. And I really feel like that ice bath was a baptism of sorts. He really let go of that innocent part of himself that he had been preserving for so long and trying to hold on to. And I feel like that was a turning point. After that baptism of sorts, he really starts to turn into the character that we see at the end of the movie. And this is almost instantaneous. Like right after the ice bath, when he goes back to school, he's walking different, similar to how Juan walked in the earlier scenes of the film. And then he goes in and breaks the chair over Terrell's head, and he's not the same after that. And it's really heartbreaking to see that he really tried to hold on to who he was for so long, and it just broke him to keep being abused by the people around him and by his circumstances. And it was just really unbearable.
I'll go next. Similar to Mackenzie, I have a couple of scenes that really kind of stuck out to me. The first one is the scene after they beat him up in the circle, right? And he goes to like, is it the principal's office? And she's talking to him and kind of trying to help him or whatever. And he's just not hearing it. He's so upset. And so the part of that scene that really stuck out to me was towards the end, where he was kind of looking down. The background kind of faded, and the camera really focused on his face, and he just looked so angry. And like that moment for me kind of signaled the start of the change into Black, right? So like that was the first moment we see his overflow of just pure anger and rage and being fed up with having to deal with things that he's having to deal with. And so like that's like the first moment of significant change kind of in his personality for me. And then the second scene is the scene where we get kind of this shot of Little kind of in a almost translucent kind of way. And like he's looking at the ocean, and then he looks back and the camera kind of focuses on his eyes. And that really, really stuck out to me because, eyes and like the beach, water, ocean, those are two running motifs, throughout the film. And so like whenever the film focuses on the eyes, it's kind of a almost window to the soul type thing. Like little Chiron, Black, they don't really talk much throughout the film, but everything is expressed through their eyes, right? And so, when we got that shot and it was towards the end, that kind of like just brought everything back. Like, wow, this is where it started. And so and this is how far we've progressed and all these things that have happened. Um, and then the second part of that, with being at the beach, like I said, it's a running motif. Like every time, something important kind of happens in his life, there's some water, when Juan was teaching him how to swim, they're at the beach, the camera's bouncing up and down in the water and everything like that. Even when he was driving on the highway, like you could hear the ocean in the background when he was going to see Kevin. And so that scene at the end just kind of really brought those two huge concepts in the movie and just really tied everything together well. Like, yeah, he changed, but at the end of the day, he's still the same kind of person at his core, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I know we keep hitting the ocean scene, but it's such an important scene. So I kind of have like a scene and a half. But just like the ocean scene, something Mackenzie mentioned was that it's kind of like baptismal almost, and I really like that made me think because I was thinking about when Juan and Little are sitting after that, and he's telling Little about running around in Cuba and all of that. It sort of feels like he's giving him I thought of the word parable in that moment, like the way he's speaking to him and the way that Little doesn't quite get what he's getting after, but it's something that like we'll think about as the audience and we'll remember that later on. And like one of the questions that we had to sort of think about before this panel was about the line that in Moonlight black boys look blue and sort of what that means, and it feels like one of those like things that just sticks with you throughout the entire movie. And then on this like viewing of it, I caught the line right before it, which is he was talking about running around catching all the light, and I think that's really the meat of what Juan is trying to teach Little, is that you have to go and catch the light. Like you have to be seen by other people. Like you can't just watch the whole time, because that's what Little and throughout his life does, but he doesn't really allow people to see him. And I think that's sort of what Juan is trying to get after in that moment. Um, and I mean, it's a really beautiful scene too. Just I have spent time with that, just at like half speed, and just watching that, and sort of it goes back to the discomfort thing because you're at like eye level with the water, and like I totally agree. Like I'm like holding my breath when it goes under. But then something that sort of the one part of the movie that I can't go without mentioning is the "You're the only man who's ever touched me." Like that moment, just you just break. Like that is just the epitome of all of this building tension that we didn't know where it was going. Like we don't know what happens after this either, but it's just that moment is so vulnerable and so intimate in a way that Chiron has been working for and failing at for a lot of his life. And so it's just so impactful that he says that to Kevin, and we don't get to see what happens, because that's between them, and that's up to them. And it's hopeful in that way, and I really like that it's kind of hopeful, even though it's not a happy ending, but it is not a bad ending either. And I think that's something to be asked for, I guess. You don't want it to tie up all nice and tie all the loose ends, but you also don't want it to be this tragic ending. And I really like that it doesn't give you one or the other.
I would say that first of all, those were all my favorite scenes, but I don't want to talk anymore on them because you guys discussed them beautifully. One of my favorite scenes, or the one that stuck out to me the most, was the dinner scene at the very end. And it's not only the part where they're in the diner, it's the part where he's walking up to the diner. So it's he's getting ready. He's putting the shirt on, he's getting the chain back out, getting his hair, closing the door, the music shuts off, and it's dark, and you hear the cars, and the cars are like, they're almost imitating the breeze that we've been so familiar with this entire time, but it's not the breeze. It's different. But there is that aspect of familiarity in there. And he's walking up, and it's dark. And as soon as he opens the door, the bell dings, and there's this music, and there's this warmness, and I wasn't expecting that. I was mad. I was mad at Kevin. I was mad at what he did. We didn't see that chunk of time. We didn't see Chiron heal, if he even ever did heal. We just saw the pain. And then that pain, we went straight to the diner, and I was still in pain, and I was very livid. That's the right word. I was livid. And so we get in there, and it's just warm and it's nice, and there's some nice orange hues that are going around the diner, and I just feel like I want to be in the diner. Like, I want to eat that food. I want to eat that Cuban food. And as as soon as he sees Kevin, it's almost like, whoa, okay, are you gonna see Chiron? That was a super anxious moment for me. I was just like, okay, he's looking, no, he's not looking. Oh, he's almost there, no, he's not there. So it was familiarity mixed with anxiety, and all these emotions were going in, and then finally they look at each other and they see each other, and it's just still. And it's almost like I don't hear the music, and I don't, I see the warm tones, but I don't pay attention to them. I'm just looking at the eyes. And it's almost like I had known Kevin for a decade, and I'm just looking at him and I'm like, wow, you're here, you're in front of me, this is crazy. um and then the scene, well, I guess this is all scenes packed into one. I just really went all for it. All right. The one where he's cooking the meal for Kevin, this is the last scene I'll talk about. That one, as I'm watching it the second time, it was a lot different than the first time. I was It was almost like I was in that kitchen with Kevin. Kevin did not know that I was there. And it was like I was spying on him making this meal for a friend that he had beat up and left and never seen again. And it was like, wow. I mean, wow, like, how can you, the first thing that you're going to put in front of him, it's this meal. This is such an important meal, and it's food. It's the one thing that Chiron throughout his life has been drawn to, and it was at the table with Teresa and Juan when they were talking about all those things and all those very hard topics to discuss as a child. And the just again, the familiarity of the food, that one thing really brought that whole entire scene together. And he sets that plate down, and they have some laughs, and they have some wine, and they share this song, and then they go back out into the darkness. The bell dings a couple of times, but they go back out into this darkness. But this time the darkness is not, he's not alone. He's with Kevin. And it's a nicer feeling when you're not alone. So that was a couple of my favorite scenes there.
I love watching this film, and I think as much I love listening to you all describe with great love and detail the scenes that I remember and recognize. And like, I don't know if you like what, I don't know if you can see it, like I'm all like clutching my chest with like great like joy um and a sense of like letting the movie wash over me all over again with this precise attention to various kinds of detail. And so I'm really impressed with how the film can elicit from you such careful like memory, right? So like, because like y'all are like play by play, shot by shot, like the bell and the shirt and the water and the camera and like the tub. I mean, like just, it's just so careful. And so props to y'all there. We have some questions from the audience, and I before we go there, I want to make a couple of comments here. One student who is watching, Sophia, beautifully wrote about the scene that precedes Black's drive to Kevin when he's with his mother, right? And students have, in conversation and in writing, helped me to appreciate the ways that reconciliation with Kevin isn't possible without that sequence with Paula, the I love you, the apology, the tears. James Laxton, the cinematographer, said that it wasn't part of the script for the embrace to happen. And so he's there with his camera, and suddenly there's the tears and there's the reaching over and the holding that he wasn't expecting. And so what we have in that moment is like this documentary flash of comfort. I mean, Somi's point about not being alone, but in that moment, the embrace instead of the solitude, the reaching toward instead of remaining closed off. And so if you think about that shot itself, the scale is kind of relatively, I think of Mac's point about the unsettledness or the stress or the pressure in each shot. It's a scene of coming together, yet the scene is not comfortably staged, right? Like the bodies are filling the frame and you're kind of like, oh, there's a shoulder and an elbow that we're getting that isn't at a distance that allows us to comfortably observe this beautifully scripted sequence, right? So like there's this like spontaneity that the cinematography seems to capture, and that reconciliation and that comforting. Sophia, I remember writing so beautifully about how she tries to light the cigarette and that Black reaches over and helps her, right? That it's that little gesture of seeing her need and frustration and his easing that pressure, that stress, those little gestures throughout the film that help us to prepare for what otherwise would be so hard to appreciate. It's not quite the word, but to buy, like per Somi's argument there, that this reconciliation can happen after the pain that Kevin has just years ago caused him, but just for us in our screen memory here. So we've got some audience questions about, oh, and one more thing too. Alex Hibbert, who plays Little, he's actually like learning to swim in that sequence that you're describing too. So that's another like documentary moment of this being Mahershala Ali with Alex Hibbert in the water with Barry Jenkins and James Laxton shooting the sequence. And Alex Hibbert, the actor, is trusting Mahershala Ali, the actor, to hold him while they're playing Juan and Little in this mentoring relationship. And they knew full well that the storm was going to come in, so they had to rush it, right? So there's this pressure of catching something quickly and desperately with fear that is actually being like positively recorded on the film itself. But folks want to hear about whether there are particular qualities. We've all mentioned these details, but I wonder if you can point to like the music, the score, the sound, cinematography, the editing, the mise en scène, the acting, things that stand out for you. So you've nicely addressed particular sequences, but are there qualities that you want to address? A colleague of mine, the lovely Dr. Josh Glick, has mentioned further the close-ups of faces, right? So that diner scene is so different if we watch them in a long shot rather than a close-up, right? So facial close-ups or any quality of the film form here, film style, things you want to address. Also, before I've got so many things to ask you, but I realize Jasmine is our moderator, but Jasmine is also a very, very smart film student. And so I don't know if it's appropriate for me to be like, hey, Jasmine, what do you think? But I know that Jasmine has things to share too. So maybe we could start with Jasmine if you want to like comment on things that have been asked or said, but then if you want to mention those qualities of film style as well.
Yeah, for sure. First of all, I love everything that everyone said. I feel like it's kind of hard to follow up after you guys, but I just think that one theme that really stood out to me in this film is like the theme of water, and like you hear like the first sound you hear when the film begins is like sounds of the ocean, and you hear like swooshing, and you can already like start to notice that this will be like a recurring theme. And then of course like all the beach scenes, and then at the end, one of my favorite scenes or like shots was when Little was standing in front of the ocean and his skin looks blue, and like the entire scene looks blue, which is also like another element like color, the color blue, and like he turns to the camera and he's looking. I just like that combination of like the color blue and like water. I think it probably addresses the theme of like vulnerability and finally being able to just be yourself and just be open when like throughout the entire film he little black Chiron was subjected to so much like distress and traumatic experiences, and finally like whenever he's around water he just feels free and open, and so I like that theme of water a lot.
I wanted to piggyback right off of that because I totally agree. And a lot of my points have to do with sound as well as how they relate to the shots that they accompany. Like when the movie first starts, we hear the ocean, and the next thing is the slow rise of the sound that we find out later is Juan's car. And I love that, the fact that things are being introduced before we see them. And those are like cues, like immediately I know I'm by a coast. Immediately after the music starts to play after that, I'm like expecting to see people. And then that's the first character that's introduced is Juan, who we later find out is instrumental. And then the next scenes that I think are really important that go with sound as well as the cuts and film style are the ones where Chiron has just came home after his mom told him the night before that he had to find somewhere else to be. And he comes home and she's looking for him. She's frantic. And as we get the close up of her face, we get to look directly in her eyes, the same way that Chiron is face to face with his mother as he thinks that she's saying that she misses him. And then we like get to pan back and forth between their faces to see how they're reacting to one another. And we really get to see that confusion on Chiron's face as he navigates this odd experience as well. And then during those pans back and forth as she's talking and she's kind of discombobulated, there's moments where she's completely tuned out. There's no sound at all. We have her speaking, we pan to Chiron, and then we pan back and she's speaking with no sound. Her lips are just moving. And this happens more than once. Again, in the office, like Josh said, when he's talking to the administrator about what's happened to him, he does the same thing. As she's talking, she slowly just tones out and it's her talking and there's nothing being heard. And I think that's really a testament to how Chiron is dealing with the things that he can't express. He's dealing with it by not feeling it at all or not experiencing all of it. He's tuning out most of it and experiencing it from that like disembodied place.
For me, a couple of things that really, really stuck out and kind of provided a lot of the depth that we see in the film is the camera work and, you know, the spatial depth like of the camera. Like, so one of the very first scenes of the film, we see Juan driving, right? And then he gets his destination, he gets out, he's talking to this guy, the camera starts rotating around them. You know, we've been talking about, you know, having this feeling of unease throughout the whole film. And I feel like that's took that and spiked it, right? Because we're experiencing things as the camera does, right? So we're circling these two people, and you know, generally when the camera's circling two people, it's an aggressive altercation, right? And so the unease is kind of heightened by that almost gut response that we have to just a simple motion, right? And so like I just feel like that was a really, really important scene, right? And another example work when Chiron, um, after the scene where he's in the office, right after they beat him up and everything, he comes to school the next day and clearly not happy. Like the camera is following him, and it's really shaky, and the people that are standing in the background, the other kids at the school, they're not completely blurred out, but they're also not something that he is obviously super just hyper aware of, right? Because he's like on a mission, he's focused, he's upset, and all of that reflects in the camera when he hits Terrell over his head with a chair, right? Camera kind of it shifts down to the floor. Now we're kind of looking up a little bit, right? And that kind of makes that like just has a much bigger effect, right? And then so it's just the camera movement is just so instrumental. It creates a lot of the tension and maybe relief, or it just stimulates a lot of emotion. And going back to depth, like again, I keep going back to the scene because I really, really love it. It's so important, I feel. But the scene like after after they beat him up and he's in the office talking to the administrator, and like Mackenzie said, she was talking and she fades, like her voice fades, but like the background also fades. It becomes really fuzzy, and so the camera kind of focuses almost like not a full close up, but just like a little, it focuses on Chiron and all of those feelings, all of those emotions, all of those experiences and traumas that he has and can't express just shows up right on his face. And because that is what's being focused on and everything else in the background is so blurry, that just shows us that like this is how he's feeling. Like this is what he's going through, right? And how can he express it? He can't. And so it's kind of heart shattering in a way, also kind of primes you for what comes next. Like it makes you understand like his movements and the things he does and like why he's okay existing in a life that he knows is not going in a positive direction.
Yeah, so I also like really love. I wanted to hit on like the circular like movement of the camera because that occurs most prominently, I think, in his childhood. So you see it when we get introduced to Juan, and then also when he's being bullied, and also a little bit there's that same sort of movement in the ocean scene. So it sort of encapsulates the feeling of little of just being like dizzy in the world and just being sort of just out of place continuously. And so that I think adds to the power of that ocean scene where he's like relaxed in Juan's hands and he's like, I'm not gonna let you go. Like you can trust me. Like he's finding a place to relax into. And so it's just that sort of development. You don't see it quite as much in the later parts of his life. So I think that's really interesting, like just camera development. But then also because of the way the camera moves a lot, like Josh mentioned, like you're feeling the feelings of Charon reflected in the camera movement, and that kind of works both with and against sort of that documentary feeling that Dr. Kim talked about, because in some moments you're seeing it as this outside perspective, like as you're watching like a home movie or something, or just someone following Chiron, but then also there are these moments where we're just kind of on the edge of interiority, like we're just so close to figuring it out because he's so close to figuring it out, but you never quite get there until that kind of in the very last scene you kind of get as close as we get to it, and it's sort of you're always just like holding your breath on the edge of your seat, like are we gonna figure this out with him, and it's just sort of the camera does a lot of that work with you while you're watching.
Yeah, wow, that was beautiful. The one I wanted to point out was camera circling. I wanted to contrast that with the smooth and comforting camera of when Chiron is with Teresa and Juan. I mean, it's so nicely just going back and forth. Not even going back and forth. It's just kind of staying there, but it's barely moving. and it's like Chiron is existing nicely with the world when he's with them. I just wanted to put that comment in there. And then the one I wanted to talk about was the orchestral music that's played throughout. I'm going to have to watch the film a third time because I did not pay as much attention to when it was prominent. Unfortunately, I wish I did. But yeah, that's another point. You gotta just keep going and keep watching this film. So new things will pop up all the time. But the one that I'm remembering, I'm gonna go back to that ocean scene, the swimming scene, when the orchestra music starts playing and those strings come out. Usually with orchestra music, it's relaxing. You sit there and it's like, okay, this is nice. But there, it was not relaxing. I felt like it was just intensifying all the moments and the feelings, and I was stressed. I was very stressed. And usually with this lovely cello and violin and viola and bass, I'm assuming I'm at ease, but I was not. And I think this film really captured those feelings with the music. I wish I could speak more on that, but again, I didn't pay as much attention to it, but I did want to mention that.
I love the way, Somi, that your response like performs the richness of this film, right? That like that there's so much about which we can continually feel curious, right? That the sequences that I personally have taught in so many different classes, and every time that I teach them, it is not like a phoning it in performance of, yeah, here's the things I want to say. Like it is always an experience of discovery because the film is so, I think back to one of the very first comments here in our discussion, the film just gives so much, right? Like the film just is so benevolent, so full. And I think about the spirit with which it's made. There's so much to talk about here. I'm curious, Jasmine, how are we for time? I know that we've got to like eventually wrap things up, even as I want to like have us, this is the most comforting and exciting hour of a very stressful week. So this is really, I don't want to like leave this and then have to like look at the news. But I'm really, so Jasmine, are we okay for time for like maybe another question?
Yeah, just like one more question.
Okay, so here's something that I'm really curious about. Maybe you're aware of the Criterion Collection, right? The Criterion Collection is, they distribute DVDs, Blu-rays, they have a really fancy website. It's kind of like an archive of canonical films that their editors and deem worthy of preservation and distribution, right? And so it's recently become a real point of concern that I wrote the numbers down here. That currently there are 461 directors represented in the Criterion Collection, and only 4 of these directors are African American, right? And so there was a survey conducted through the New York Times asking y'all, like, what would, well, the New York Times wouldn't say you all, but that's my Southern revision of their question, but asking readers, what would you all add to the Criterion Collection? And Moonlight was one of the choices, very high on the list. And so that's what question that I want to ask to you here. In part, your answers have beautifully performed this question as to what you think the film's legacy is. But to what extent do you imagine this film as both kind of timeless, like transcending the particularity of this historical moment, and also evocative of this moment, right? There's no mention in Moonlight of 2016, right? Yet the ways in which that film is coming to stand for a particular stress point in our recent history is something that we're aware of, but maybe 20 years down the road wouldn't be as legible. So I'm curious about what you project, right? Because 20 years from now, you're going to remember this conversation you were part of, and you're going to think about how that, okay, I get all excited about those kinds of projections here, but what do you imagine as the value of this film in the future? Is it a film that shows audiences how it feels to be alive now? Is it a film that is more timeless? I guess that question also relates to another one with regard to empathy and universality versus particularity and identity, right? So some reviewers are all like, this movie is for everybody. It's so universal. It's so much about the human condition, right? But there's another essay I think really well taken that says, y'all, like this isn't, not y'all, but this isn't universal. This is about gay, Black, male experience. And to claim it as universal and about humanity is another kind of erasure, right? So I guess my question is a little twofold here. Is the value of Moonlight in its universality and timelessness, this like these big abstractions, or is the value in its particularity and singularity here? It's evocative, it's evocation of this time period and a particular kind of identity. Or, I mean, as is my always answer is like both, but I'm curious as to how you might reflect on those questions of historical value and also universality and humanity versus particularity and identity.
Wow. Oh, sorry. Okay. Oh, okay. um. Wow. So I would say both. I think this film hit me in the way that it didn't teach me to forgive, but it taught me that I should be more willing to forgive. I should, because when I first watched it, I was like, no, I don't want to forgive. I don't want to forget. But he didn't forget. He kind of moved forward and still got that sense of loving. And I think that is universal. I think that aspect is universal. But in terms of sexuality, or being Black or being gay, I think that in a way that kind of took that time period of when the movie was made. But I do think it's going to stand for years to come because those ideas and just the prominence of that in that time and still in this time, I don't think that'll go away. I think its powerfulness will stick with us and remind us of this time that we are in right now.
I have to agree. I would also say that, it has qualities of both. Um, Generally speaking, you know, what he's kind of emotions that he feels can, generally be related to other people, right? People that don't necessarily exist with the same conditions. Um, and so I feel like, in that aspect, it is something that is universal. Like Somi said, like learning to forgive is something that, everyone has to do at some point. And so I feel like that's the big universal aspect, but where it gets particular, at least, for me, the biggest part of its particularity is that it is a film that highlights the experience of a gay Black man in America, right? And I feel like that is such a unique space to exist in and a very unique existence to experience. Because on one hand, you're a part of the LGBTQ community and, people tend to be hateful a lot of times. It's like you're getting whatever hate and, whatever trauma you're experiencing on that end, but you're also getting all the trauma that comes with having to exist as a Black man, right? in the world, in America, like just period. And so, when you have those two sorts of trauma, like that are kind of the same experiences, but not really, they stack onto each other and it kind of heightens, right? And so I feel like following the life of someone that exists in that unique space and, you know, kind of having them find a type of closure about things. Like, I feel like that is where the film becomes very uniquely particular. And I think it works. I think it works to have both because, while you might relate to this particular audience on such a deep spiritual level, you're not thinking, everyone else that doesn't have those particular circumstances, but, maybe similar experiences in different ways.
Yes, I completely agree with both of you. I think this film plays such just a monumental role in representation because of the fact that it is so particular, as Josh said, like the life of the experiences of this Black boy, Black man, queer Black man living in a society that doesn't always welcome him with open arms, and not even society, just even within his community. And the reason why I feel like, even though the story is so unique, its uniqueness allows us so many levels of connection. You don't have to experience every part of Chiron's life to understand what he's feeling. And I feel like that's what this film gives us in a lot of ways, is that ability to empathize, because while you may not understand every part of Chiron's struggle, there's some part of it that resonates with you. And I think that's why this film will continue to be timeless and should be added to the collection, because as long as people feel as Chiron does or experience a reality like Chiron's or similar in any way, or connect with the story on some level, it will be a life-changing experience for whoever views that film. And I think it's important to have those opportunities, especially when they're so rare.
Yeah, I think that was really beautifully said. And something that my answer is both carefully, because there's an argument to be had that because it is so specific, that's what sort of makes it universal, because there are so many avenues for people to connect, because there are so many different just points of connection with Sharon. Like, I connect with this film a lot just on the point of like queer desire and just like growing into your identity as a queer person, and like those moments with Juan where he's like, nobody, like, don't let somebody make you feel bad for being gay, or like, how will you know, like, you just know, like, just sort of the way he grows into that is something that, like, I look at and I go, I can connect with this point. But I think more importantly than that, it's recognizing that you can connect a piece of your identity to someone else's identity. You can build that bridge, but you have to recognize that you don't live there at the end of the day the way that they do. And so you can make these connections, but you have to recognize that that other person has a combination of identities that you don't have. And you find the places where you connect, but you have to be respectful of, and you have to sort of work through, I guess, those differences. And you can connect without trying to erase the other parts of someone's identity, And so I think that's a really important thing that the film does, is that it allows everyone who watches it to connect, even if they don't have 100% of the life experiences that Chiron does, but they have one of them, and that's enough.
Yeah, I agree with everything said, and I think that it is universal and timeless for anyone who views it, but specifically for the Black community, because it just has such an authentic depiction of Black culture. And like, we can see, we probably know someone like a Chiron, or we see these instances and circumstances tragic circumstances in our real lives, and we connect to it. So I think that it's timeless in that sense. But again, like everyone can connect to it, whether they have, or they're struggling with their identity or, sexuality. I think it's timeless in that sense. And also, Barry Jenkins, he's like, I think the only like Black director to win Best Picture at the Academy Awards, and I think that that's so iconic, and we hold that up, and that's probably why it will forever be cherished in the film world and to all film lovers. So yeah, that's kind of my take on it. But I think we're way past time. But I've loved. No, you're good. I loved hearing everyone's like commentary. It was just beautiful. I definitely look at this film in a new light because of you guys. You were all just so detailed, and it was just great. Thank you to all of our student panelists, Somi, Michaela, Mackenzie, and Josh. You guys were wonderful. And thank you to Dr. McKim. You are an excellent leader in this discussion, and I really appreciate you. Thank you so much. And I just think that this was a great conversation to end the series on. It was wonderful, and I'm glad everyone was a part of it. So thank you, everyone. And that concludes Black Representation Matters and Film and Beyond film series. Thanks for everyone for participating. I think it was executed wonderfully because people came out and supported it and were a part of it. And I'm so appreciative. So thank you. And with that, I will say good night.